The truck stopped. No shouting. No guards yelling orders. No angry crowd. Only silence. The women sat frozen in the back, hands tight around their small bags. One of them whispered in German, "Why isn't anyone shouting?" The canvas flap opened. Cold Canadian air rushed inside, sharp, clean, unfamiliar. One woman braced herself. She expected stones, spit, insults. Instead, a child waved. A woman standing beside the road held a basket. Bread. Fresh bread. The prisoners didn't move. This had to be a trick. Another villager stepped forward. He smiled. No one spoke. No one protested. No one showed anger. One of the prisoners whispered the question that none of them understood. Why don't they hate us? But what the women didn't know was that this quiet village was about to change everything they believed about the enemy. And one small act of kindness would leave them confused for years. The year was 1943. The war in Europe was at its peak. Cities were burning. Families were being torn apart. And across the Atlantic, Canada was preparing for something unusual. Thousands of German prisoners were being transported far from the battlefield. Canada had space, security, distance. Prison camps were built deep inside forests and rural areas. But there was one problem. These prisoners were not only soldiers. Some were women. Nurses, clerks, support personnel, communication workers. They had served the German war machine, but they had never expected to become prisoners in a distant land. Canadian authorities were cautious. The rules were strict. No contact with locals. Limited movement. Constant supervision. Villages were warned. These people were the enemy. Many Canadians had lost relatives overseas. The expectation was simple. Resentment. Distance. Suspicion. And at first, that's exactly what happened. When the transport orders arrived for one small rural village, the local council prepared for tension. Extra guards were requested. Community leaders warned residents to stay away. But something strange happened even before the prisoners arrived. The local baker doubled his production. The church committee organized a meeting. And one farmer asked a question that would quietly shape everything that followed. They're prisoners, but they're still people, aren't they? No one answered him. But the mood in the village was already changing. Inside the transport truck were 32 German women. Most were between 18 and 30 years old. Among them was Anna, a former radio operator. Disciplined, quiet, suspicious. Another was Greta, a military nurse who had treated wounded soldiers for 2 years straight. Then there was Liesel, the youngest. She had never left Germany before the war. For months, they had been told the same thing. The Allies hate you. You will be treated badly. You cannot trust them. The journey across the ocean had reinforced their fears. Barbed wire, guards, silence. No one explained where they were going. Every stop felt temporary. Every order felt cold. Inside the truck, the women spoke quietly. What if the locals attack us? What if they don't feed us? What if we never leave? Anna noticed something strange during the final leg of the journey. The guards seemed relaxed. One even joked with the driver. That worried her more. Why weren't they tense? What kind of place were they being taken to? And when the truck slowed near the village, none of them were prepared for what they would see. The first days were confusing. The camp was small, clean, quiet, too quiet. No shouting guards. No harsh punishments. Meals arrived on time. But something felt strange. On the second morning, the women noticed fresh milk in their breakfast. Milk wasn't standard rations. Where did this come from? Greta asked. No one knew. Later that week, a guard quietly handed Liesel a pair of gloves. It gets cold here, he said. No explanation. No report. Then came the first unsettling moment. During a supervised work detail near the village, the women felt eyes on them. They expected angry stares. But the villagers weren't glaring. They were watching carefully. One elderly woman nodded. Another placed something near the roadside. When the prisoners passed, they saw it. Apples. Fresh apples. Anna refused to take one. This isn't normal, she whispered. Why would they help us? And that question began to spread through the group. Was this kindness? Or something else? Winter arrived without warning. One morning, the ground was only cold and damp. By evening, snow covered everything. The fences, the watchtowers, the narrow paths between the barracks. The air burned in the lungs. Breath turned to white clouds. Inside the barracks, the women wrapped themselves in thin blankets, listening to the wind push against the wooden walls. It didn't sound like winter. It sounded like something trying to get in. And by the third day, supplies began to slow. The morning bread delivery didn't arrive. At first, no one panicked. Delays happened. But when lunch came, portions were smaller. Half slices instead of full. Thinner soup. Greta noticed immediately. This is ration reduction, she whispered. Anna counted the pieces carefully. Something was wrong. And no one was explaining why. By the next morning, the kitchen posted a short notice. Temporary supply interruption. Reduced rations until further notice. The words were simple. But inside the barracks, silence spread. They had seen this before. Reduced rations meant one thing. Hunger was coming. And winter had just begun. The guards seemed tense. More quiet than usual. One of them avoided eye contact during distribution. Another checked the storage room twice. Anna watched carefully. The shelves were nearly empty. That wasn't normal. The camp always kept reserve stock. So where had it gone? By evening, the wind became stronger. Snow covered the main road leading to the village. Transport trucks couldn't pass. The kitchen fire burned low. That night's meal was the smallest yet. Some women saved half their portion. Not for later. For tomorrow. Because they didn't know if tomorrow would come with food. That night, the barracks were louder than usual. Not talking. Stomachs. The sound of hunger is quiet. But it's constant. A shifting body. A dry cough. Someone turning again and again, unable to sleep. Liesel whispered from her bunk. Will they let us starve? No one answered. Because no one knew. The next morning brought something even more worrying. The camp commander left. No announcement. No explanation. Just a jeep heading toward the village before sunrise. The guards stayed behind. But their expressions were different. Watching the road. Waiting. For what? Hours passed. The women were kept inside. No work detail. No movement. Just waiting. By afternoon, snow began falling again. Thick, heavy, endless. If supply trucks couldn't arrive yesterday, they wouldn't arrive today. And maybe not tomorrow. Inside the kitchen, the final flour sack was opened. The cook shook it carefully. Almost empty. That's when fear became real. Evening approached. No commander. No deliveries. The women sat quietly, conserving energy, talking less, moving less, because hunger makes every movement expensive. Then, just after sunset, they heard engines. Not one, several, but the sound was wrong. Slower, heavier, not military trucks. The guards rushed toward the gate. Snow crunched under boots. Inside the barracks, the women moved toward the windows. Through the frost-covered glass, shapes appeared. Wagons, farm wagons, pulled by tractors and horses. And behind them, people, civilians, from the village. The gate opened. One by one, the wagons rolled inside. No shouting, no speeches, only quiet movement. Men lifting sacks, women carrying boxes, children holding smaller bundles. The guards didn't stop them. They helped. That was the first shock. Anna watched as the supplies were unloaded. Potatoes, flour, canned vegetables, milk containers, firewood stacked higher than the kitchen wall. This wasn't a small donation. This was winter stock. Enough for weeks, maybe longer. But the strangest part was the silence. The villagers weren't smiling. They weren't celebrating. They were simply working. Like this was normal. Like this was necessary. One moment stayed with the prisoners. A farmer handed the camp commander a list. The commander shook his head slightly. The farmer replied quietly, "Winter's hard enough. No one should freeze or starve." Then he walked back to his wagon. No applause. No conversation. Just snow falling around them. Inside the barracks, no one spoke. The smell reached them first. Fresh bread. Real bread. Not ration bread. Warm. Soft. For a moment, no one moved. Greta whispered, "This doesn't make sense." Anna didn't touch her portion immediately. She watched the guards, watched the doors, waited for the catch. Because kindness during war usually comes with a price. But nothing happened. No conditions. No speeches. No demands. Only food. And heat. That night, for the first time in days, the barracks were quiet. Not from fear. From full stomachs. But sleep didn't come easily. Because hunger is easier to understand than kindness. Before the lights went out, Liesel asked the question that no one could answer. If they hate us, why did they save us? No one replied. And outside, beyond the fences, the village lights stayed on late that night, as if they were still watching the camp, still making sure the enemy stayed warm. The extra supplies changed the camp overnight. The kitchen shelves were full again. The fires burned longer. Bread portions returned to normal. But inside the administration office, concern was growing. Because the food had not come through military channels. It had come from civilians. And that was not standard procedure. 2 days later, a report was sent to regional headquarters. Short, formal, careful. Local civilian assistants observed, no security breach, situation stable. But someone added a handwritten note at the bottom. Community involvement increasing. That note triggered attention. Because in wartime, involvement could mean sympathy. And sympathy could mean risk. The first inspector arrived the following week. Unannounced. A military car pulled through the gate early in the morning. The guards stood straighter. The commander spoke less. Inside the barracks, the women noticed the change immediately. Something was being checked. But what? The inspection was thorough. Food storage, security logs, work assignments, Fence lines. Nothing unusual. Everything followed regulations. Then the inspector asked the question that made the commander pause. Are civilians providing additional supplies? The commander answered carefully. They offered assistance during the storm. Was it authorized? A short silence. Not formally. The inspector wrote something down, but his expression didn't change. That worried the commander more than any reaction. Meanwhile, inside the village, the visit had already been noticed. Word spread quickly. Military inspection at the camp. Some residents became nervous. Had they done something wrong? At the church hall that evening, a small group gathered. Farmers, shop owners, the school teacher. One man spoke first. Our boys are fighting overseas, and we're feeding the enemy. The room became quiet. Then the schoolteacher replied softly. We're feeding prisoners, not soldiers. No one argued. But the tension remained. Back at the camp, the inspector stayed longer than expected. He spoke privately with several guards. One question kept repeating. Have there been any discipline issues? The answer was always the same. No. In fact, behavior reports showed something unusual. The prisoners were calmer than average. Fewer conflicts. Better cooperation. Higher work efficiency. The inspector reviewed the numbers twice. Because the pattern didn't match typical POW camps. Then he asked another question. When did this improvement begin? The commander answered honestly. After the winter assistance. The inspector wrote that down too. Inside the barracks, the women were watching everything. Extra patrols. More paperwork. Long conversations near the gate. Anna noticed the guards speaking more quietly than usual. That made her uneasy. Kindness during war could disappear quickly. And sometimes it disappeared without warning. 3 days later, another vehicle arrived. This time 2 officers. They didn't inspect the fences. They went straight to the village. That worried the residents. Had the donations gone too far? Were they about to be ordered to stop? At the general store, conversations became tense. We didn't break any laws. We only helped during the storm. What if they think we're sympathizing? No one had an answer. That evening, the town council called a meeting. Attendance was higher than usual. People wanted clarity. The mayor spoke carefully. The military is concerned about civilian involvement. Murmurs filled the room. Then an older farmer stood up. If winter comes again, should we let them freeze? Another voice followed. Our sons are fighting for what kind of country? No one mentioned Germany. No one mentioned politics. The discussion wasn't about the enemy anymore. It was about who they were. After nearly an hour, the council reached a quiet decision. No public collections. No organized deliveries. But if individuals chose to help privately, no one would stop them. The decision wasn't announced outside the room. But the message spread anyway. And the help didn't stop. It just became quieter. At the camp, the effects continued. Extra milk appeared occasionally. Wool gloves during colder days. A repaired stove part that hadn't come through military supply. The official records showed nothing unusual. But the commander knew. And he chose not to report every detail. Because there was another pattern emerging. Morale was stable. Security incidents were almost zero. And the prisoners were beginning to trust the system. That made the camp easier to manage. But it also created a quiet question. Was strict control less effective than simple decency? One afternoon, the inspector returned for a final visit. He reviewed the latest reports. No escapes. No conflicts. No sabotage. Before leaving, he gave the commander a brief instruction. Maintain regulations. Avoid public-civilian interaction. A pause. Then he added, but stability is priority. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't a warning either. Inside the barracks that night, the women received their usual dinner. Nothing special. Nothing unusual. But Liesel noticed something small. Her gloves, the ones given during the cold week, had been repaired. The stitching was new. Careful. Not military work. Village work. She held them quietly for a long time. Then she asked Anna, "Do you think they're still helping us?" Anna looked toward the dark window. Beyond the fence, the village lights were visible again. "Yes," she said softly, "but they don't want anyone to notice." And outside the camp, the kindness continued. Quiet, unrecorded, and almost invisible. Years after the war ended, the story of the village began to surface. Not through official military reports. Those were brief, technical, ordinary. No mention of unusual compassion. No description of winter convoys. No record of children's letters. On paper, the camp had been routine. But memories told a different story. And historians began asking a question. Why did this village treat the enemy with kindness when the rest of the world was driven by anger? The answers were never simple. Some researchers believed the explanation was religious influence. The village had strong church leadership. Sermons during the war focused on restraint, compassion, humanity. One archived note from a parish meeting included a single line. Hatred spreads faster than war. Former residents later recalled being told, "Your actions must reflect your values, not your anger." It sounded convincing. But there was a problem. Not everyone in the village attended church. Some of the most active donors were not religious at all. And no official church directive about helping prisoners was ever recorded. So if faith alone didn't explain it, what did? Another explanation focused on geography. The village was far from the front lines. No bombings. No destruction. No daily reminders of violence. War for them existed in newspapers and letters. Some historians argued that distance made compassion easier. But personal records complicated that theory. Many families had sons fighting in Europe. Some had already received casualty notices. Grief was present. Loss was real. So why didn't anger follow? Why didn't suffering turn into resentment? The distance theory left too many questions unanswered. A more controversial idea suggested military influence. Some historians proposed that Canadian authorities quietly allowed civilian kindness. Not for moral reasons. For control. Better treated prisoners were calmer. More cooperative. Less likely to resist or cause problems. Camp records supported part of this theory. After the winter aid began, discipline incidents dropped. Work performance improved. Security risks decreased. But there was no written policy encouraging civilian support. No orders. No guidelines. Only one vague instruction found in regional correspondence. Stable camps require stable conditions. Was that permission? Or coincidence? The documents didn't say. And many wartime files were later destroyed or never archived. The most human explanation came from oral histories. Years later, former residents gave similar answers. We didn't help Germany. We didn't help the war. We helped people who were cold and hungry. One farmer's son recalled his father saying, "If we start hatting strangers, the war changes us too." There was no meeting record confirming a community decision. No vote. No resolution. But memory suggested something unusual. The kindness wasn't organized. It spread quietly. One family delivered milk. Another repaired clothing. A teacher suggested students write letters. No one led it. And that made historians uneasy. Because movements without leaders are hard to document. And even harder to explain. The missing records. When researchers searched local archives decades later, they noticed something strange. Town council notes from several winter months were incomplete. Personal diaries mentioned the camp, but briefly. Some entries stopped suddenly. Others were removed entirely. No evidence of censorship. No proof of destruction. Just gaps. Important months, missing details. Why? Privacy. Forgetfulness. Or did residents simply believe their actions weren't important enough to record? The absence created more mystery than the surviving records. The prisoner's perspective. The most revealing clues came from the former prisoners themselves. After the war, several wrote letters back to the village. Their memories were precise. The milk during winter. The repaired gloves. The children's messages. But one detail appeared repeatedly. Confusion. They had been warned the Allies would hate them, that civilians would treat them with hostility. Instead, they experienced quiet restraint. One former prisoner wrote, "We kept waiting for the moment when the kindness would stop." According to her account, that moment never came. Each theory explained part of the story. Faith, distance, practical strategy, human instinct. But none explained everything. Why so many people participated? Why almost no one opposed it publicly? Why the kindness remained quiet instead of becoming a public effort? Why did the village never talk about it afterward? No monument was built. No annual remembrance. No public recognition. It was as if the community saw their actions as normal. Not heroic. Not unusual. Just necessary. Today, historians still debate the true explanation. Was it leadership, culture, circumstance, or something harder to measure? A collective decision made quietly, without discussion, to remain human in a time when the world was choosing sides. And maybe the most unsettling possibility is this. There was no plan, no strategy, no single reason. Just ordinary people making small choices. Again and again. Choices that were never written down. And almost forgotten. The war ended in the spring of 1945. News reached the camp quietly. Germany had surrendered. For the guards, it meant the mission was nearly over. For the prisoners, it meant something more complicated. Freedom, but also uncertainty. Because after years behind the fences, the outside world no longer felt familiar. The final months passed slowly. Processing papers, medical checks, transport lists. One by one, names were called. Groups prepared to leave. There were no celebrations, no cheering, only quiet packing, and long looks toward the village beyond the trees. Because for many of the women, that small Canadian community had become the only stable place they had known in years. On the morning of departure, trucks lined up near the gate. The same kind of trucks that had brought them there. The same cold air. The same heavy silence. But this time, something was different. As the trucks began to move, figures appeared along the roadside. Villagers, standing quietly. No speeches, no flags, no ceremony. Some held small boxes, food for the journey. Others simply raised a hand in goodbye. One elderly woman stepped forward and handed a package to the guard. Inside were knitted scarves. For the prisoners, because the journey home would be long. Inside the truck, Liesel held one of the scarves tightly. She looked back through the open canvas. The village grew smaller. The fences disappeared. The watchtower vanished behind the trees. Then she asked the question that had followed her since the first day. Why didn't they hate us? Anna didn't answer immediately. Because after 2 years, she still didn't know. Months later, many of the women returned to a destroyed country. Cities in ruins. Families missing. Food shortages everywhere. But something unexpected began to happen. Letters were written. Carefully, slowly, addressed to the village in Canada. Some letters simply said thank you. Others described how small acts had stayed in their memories. The winter supplies, the fresh milk, the repaired gloves, the children's notes. One letter included the same question again. Why were you kind to us? The reply that came back was short. Just one sentence. Because if we had hated you, the war would have lived here too. No signature. No explanation. Just that. Over time, the camp was dismantled. The barracks were taken down. The fences removed. The watchtowers disappeared. The land returned to farmland. Today, nothing remains to show that hundreds of enemy prisoners once lived there. No monument. No museum. No plaques. If you visit the area now, you would see only open fields. Quiet. Ordinary. Almost as if the story never happened. And maybe that is the final mystery. The village never called their actions heroic. They didn't organize reunions. They didn't tell their story widely. Because to them, it wasn't history. It was simply the right thing to do. In a time when the world was divided into enemies and allies, they chose something else. But the question from the beginning still echoes. The same question whispered inside the truck. The same question written years later in letters. The same question that historians still cannot fully answer. Why, in the middle of a war filled with anger, loss, and fear, did one small village choose kindness? And if we were living in that same moment, on that same road, watching the truck arrive, would we have done the same? If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done? And if you want to hear more forgotten stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes the quietest stories reveal the most about who we really are.